I'm Karyn Kusama, and I'm so excited to have a conversation with the writer-director of Wake Up Dead Man. It's so beautiful on a rainy night in LA to see this full theater, and I just want to say, having seen the film again recently, isn't it nice to see something that fills your heart? Yes! I really want art cinema so frequently. And it's interesting because tonight there's the double feature of your first film, Brick, and this film. And I actually think that these two films, in some way, are your most personal films. And I'm curious if you would identify them that way, or if you can look back at your filmography and identify sort of yourself so deeply in the work, but particularly these two films.
Yeah, and first of all, like Karyn said, guys, thank you so much for being here. It means so much. I know the trade-off of the beauty and the wonder of a 35 millimeter print is it is a piece of plastic running through a sewing machine. Let's get a handful of projections. I want to thank one of my dearest friends and one of my very favorite directors, Karyn Kusama, for being here.
It's so weird to do this like not at a dinner table.
I know.
I'm confused right now, but we'll muddle through.
This is gonna be great. This is gonna be good. Yeah, I mean, I think in some, I similar to you and and your husband Phil Hay, who's here also, who along with Matt and Freddie writes those rhythms. So I think when you guys work together, I can see the personal, connection in your films. And I think similar for me, it's hard to imagine making a movie that didn't have some kind of personal resonance. I think with Brick and with this film, it maybe is a little kind of closer to the surface. I grew up very, very Christian. I was not Catholic, I was Protestant evangelical, but through my childhood, teenage years, and all the way up through my early 20s, it wasn't just that I was in a religious household or brought to church. I was very deeply Christian. My relationship with Christ was how I framed the world around me. And I was a youth group kid. I don't know if there are any other youth group kids. Recovering youth group kids.
There's a meeting down at the
there is. Yes, exactly. After Brick, we'll do, yeah. And I'm not a Christian anymore. I fell away from it during my 20s, and I'm not a believer anymore. So I have a lot of complicated feelings about it. And that was, I don't know, the starting point for this movie was, and I remember I've talked with you and Phil about this, the whole process of it was starting out feeling like I wanted to see how deep I could kind of dig with one of these Benoit Blanc mysteries, and if I could take this thing that was such a complicated thing for myself and have kind of a multifaceted and hopefully not toothless, but also a genuinely generous in spirit kind of exploration of this thing that meant a lot to me, and do it in the context of a big, fun Benoit Blanc murder mystery. That was kind of the starting point for this.
Well, and so with the Knives Out collection of films, how do you start in the construction of a story like this? Because there are so many moments for me watching the film that hit me so hard. I think of the line, "This is not the true church." And of course I want to know, do you start with an idea, like a speculative idea? Do you start with an image? Do you start with a character? I'm just so curious how in these highly constructed puzzle boxes you begin.
Well, I mean, I start I write very structurally, and
So you outline very deeply before you started putting dialogue on
The
page?
first 80% of the process, I work in little pocket-sized moleskin notebooks, and so for me, and it is outlined, but that also kind of implies it's all plot, and it's not. It's thinking about, because I actually don't start with plot. I don't start with these movies in particular. I don't really start with the mechanics of the murder or the mystery or who done it. I found that one of the things I've learned from writing these is the mystery elements of it as a writer are kind of a shiny piece of candy. They're very tempting, and it's very important to train and constantly remind yourself that those, for the audience, are not load-bearing walls. They're not things that are going to actually keep an audience engaged. And so, so you have to start with some deeper theme, which for me was the idea of faith and Christianity, kind of in America in this moment. And you have to start more than that with just the fundamental basics of what any what any movie starts with, which is who's your protagonist, what do they want, why can't they get it, how do they get it at the end in a way that is unexpected to them and the audience. And that's the basic arc that you start with, and then you build the mystery elements to kind of support that, I guess.
Well, it's interesting because in the way that you're describing it, it's a Benoit Blanc story, and yet, or whodunit, and yet I don't see him as the main character of this this movie, and actually I see him as the detective, always. And I'm curious, in now that you've done 3 in a row, of course in a whodunit you need the detective, but do you find that there are other characters that emerge that are sort of crucial to this kind of ensemble mystery, like in a more archetypal way? Do you know what I mean?
I do, yeah. It's actually essential that the detective is not the main character. And I think in all 3 of them, like Anna de Armas's character in the first one, Chanel's character in the second one, Josh's in this one. And I think it becomes an interplay between, I mean, really, ultimately, these movies become a dance between the protagonist, the antagonist, who is generally the person who done it, and Blanc as kind of a ally to the protagonist. And but then all the suspects, I mean, the way that I don't know, for me, the way I approach, it's the hardest thing about writing these is you have to come up with a big group of suspects. The first acts of these, I mean, everyone who writes here knows the first act is a bitch. For these movies, it's really, really tough because there's so much you have to lay, and you have to set up all of the suspects. There's so much groundwork to lay, but with the suspects, for instance, in this one, the way I approach it is, every one of the suspects, it's not enough to differentiate them in terms of, oh, this one's a cellist, this one's a writer, this one's a blonde. The way that I have to approach it is every one of them is a direct reflection of my own a fragment of my own personal experience with faith, which is kind of the central hub, which is the theme of it. And starting with that means, first of all, they're actually going to have different voices because they're going to have different perspectives, but they're all going to be connected to the central theme. It also means, and this is vital, I'm going to start writing each of them from a place of empathy, from a place of recognizing a piece of myself in each of them, which or I guess especially if they're despicable characters, I'm recognizing something despicable within myself that I understand with each of them.
You can see that in the work. I mean, you can see a lot of affection for the characters, even those that are obviously hypocrites, obviously faithless. So it's interesting to imagine them all as a projection in some way, some fragment of you. Because I don't experience you as faithless at all. In fact, I think of you as somebody who does believe in a lot. So it's interesting when you say you're not a believer anymore, but clearly in Josh's character, there's someone who believes deeply in something. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Well, it's weird. When I first started writing Josh's character, it didn't work. When in the early drafts, and this was by far the hardest script I've ever written. And when I started, there was something that just wasn't working about writing Josh's character. It felt wrong, and I realized after a couple of laborious drafts, I realized I was writing him from the perspective of myself as a 51-year-old who was no longer a believer. And so I had to, and again, any writers here know it's a bit like method acting. I realized I had to genuinely put myself back in the place of myself.
True
faith when I was a believer. And that's also the reason I felt I could do it is because I had that experience in life. And so, but man, it was a trip. It was therapeutic. It was weird. It was a lot of things. It was very powerful, actually, genuinely putting myself back in the place in my life when I was a Christian and when I was, seeing the world through that lens.
I'm so curious because the church that you depict in this town is so beautiful. And what was the church that you went to? What did it look like?
Well, so I was not Catholic growing up. I was Protestant, evangelical. And the reason the movie is set in a Catholic church is because the churches I grew up going to largely look like pottery barns. Phenomenally ugly spaces.
So it doesn't kind of bring the Gothic splendor.
No.
Yeah.
In terms of aesthetics, the Catholic Church, say what you want, they've got us on beats.
It's true. They really nailed down the aesthetics. It's true. It's funny because then I guess it's interesting that you chose a church that then does have like literal visual beauty. And of course one wonders like what would, I guess it's like an interesting thing to think about, what would the movie have been if it were in a pottery barn?
Such a mega church, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's also, I know it's also a bit like, growing up as a Protestant, the Catholic Church honestly was like exoticism. It was kind of creepy, and the aesthetics so intense and kind of scary, and also kind of awe-inspiring. And so there's a little bit of this movie of for me growing up in that world and saying in the Catholic Church. It kind of like, Sergio Leone making the most vibrant, beautiful portrait of the American West possible as someone who grew up in Italy. There's something where, as an outsider, because there's a bit of fetishism that I have about it, because seeing it from the outside in that way, that I don't know, maybe dig into it in that way a little deeper.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, can you talk about the transition from writing these stories that are quite intricate? And then you direct the film, you're modulating performance, and then you're in the cutting room. What, if any, adjustments or unseen or unexpected questions came up in the editing phase of actually dealing with the thing in front of you? Because it's so intricate narratively.
Yeah, it's both different and very much similar to any other film and the one thing that you don't have with these movies in the cutting room is it's not like you can put the cards up on the wall and start shifting stuff around in big ways, which can work in other types of movies. With this, because there is a little bit of the jigsaw puzzle nature of it, you don't end up doing that. What it ends up being, though, is much more a question of, pacing is a huge thing, clarity is a huge thing in the edit, and it ends up being just trade-offs. For instance, if we take these 6 seconds to set this thing up, then it'll be paid off, this little clue that we're setting up, then the audience will recognize it at the end and it'll be paid off. Is it worth these 6 seconds in the context of the scene? So it's all about making trade-offs. Towards the, I think I told you about this, towards the end of the edit process, a week before we were supposed to go in mix, so we should have been locked. I was very insecure about the running time of the movie because it's the longest of all the films. I have been watching a lot of pre-code movies with my wife, Karyn Kusama, and a lot of 70-minute movies, and I was just beating myself up like, this movie's too long, the movie should be this long. And so But I was also genuinely thinking, have I been hard enough on the movie because of all the personal stuff in it? Have I turned the screws? Have I been precious? So I went in for a weekend with my editor, Bob Doucet, and just the two of us went in alone to the cutting room. We made a copy of the movie in the Avid, so it was just an exercise. We weren't cutting the movie. And I put on the persona of like an asshole studio head.
Face it up.
I did. I was like, wow, why are we in the fucking church still? No one wants to see this bullshit. Stand up and
the person's reaction.
Are we still looking at Glenn Close? And so I put on that persona, and we cut basically from the movie that you guys watched. We cut half an hour out of it. Literally anything we could cut, we cut. And it was. I have to say though, it was therapeutic because, as anyone who's made a movie in here knows, when you get to the end of the editing process, you hate your movie so much. It's a little bit like in Pleasure Island and Pinocchio, just smashing everything. It's like a rage room, just getting to hack it with a machete feels really cathartic. But also, it ended up being a wonderful thing because, first of all, because we did find a couple of things where like, oh, some version of that cut would work. But most of it was, we then sat down and watched it kind of cut down to the bone, and seeing what was missing from the emotional experience of watching the movie gave me the confidence to say, okay, this is why this belongs in the movie. This is why this has to be here. I don't know. It was something I had never done before.
I mean, it's so important, I think, to go through the exercise of getting to what's ephemeral about your film, like about meaning and feeling, which sometimes is this accumulation of looks and gestures and the light coming through in a certain way. And sometimes you just need to have that and have faith to a degree that the audience will go along with you on the ride.
How do you, real quick, when you cut your movies, do you tend to cut very deep to the bone, or are you like?
I go loose and then cut down, and I'm always told that my movies are too long or
not by me.
I appreciate that, but it is really interesting to go through that exercise you're talking about, where you take a lot out just to see if it will feel different, but oftentimes I do think you can have the kind of terrifying experience of feeling nothing at all. And it's interesting because this movie is so much about the nature of being open to feeling and to this sense of grace, the grace of God, which is a beautiful thing to put in a mainstream movie. And yet, what's interesting is this movie is also quite a bit darker in sensibility and in some visual direction for you. Was that something you always knew, that it was going to almost play a little more gothic, a little bit more spooky?
Yeah, that was from the start. And the author that we name check in this, John Dixon Carr, who I would highly recommend to anyone who is a murder mystery fan. John Dixon Carr, he was a contemporary of Agatha Christie's. He was part of kind of the golden age of detective fiction. He was American. He was one of ours, but he passed for a Brit, basically. He lived in England his whole life, and so and he wrote impossible crime mysteries. He was the master of them. The bigger thing, though, is he wrote in the tone of this movie. He wrote in this kind of gothic horror tone, much closer to Edgar Allan Poe. He would always veer towards the supernatural with the solutions of his mysteries and then pull it back at the last minute. He was a fantastic writer. His detective Gideon Fell is actually my favorite detective in all of whodunit fiction. And yeah, Carr is a fantastic writer. And if anyone is going to look up Carr, The Hollow Man is brilliant, which we reference here. I also just kind of love the title for how it worked in this movie. It's not my favorite book of his. I would say start with the book. Start with Hag's Nook is a fantastic book. And it's the first thing. Hag's Nook.
Great.
That's such a good title. That's a good title. Or Hag's Nook, The Crooked Hinge. Yeah. The Mad Hatter mystery? Are you kidding me? Yeah. Anyway, look it up. Let's start the John Carr songs. Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up the impossible crime or the impossible mystery, and yet you put it in this movie that's interrogating a lot of the tenets of Christian faith, particularly to me, the notion of the resurrection. And as you were, I mean, it's sort of interesting to think about the radical quality of being a person who's moved beyond this true faith that you experienced. Was there anything kind of frightening about taking this on? Like, you know, a lot of your family is still deeply religious. Obviously, much of the world is deeply religious. Did you feel any fear in delving into it, or was there something quite freeing about it?
Oh, lots of fear. So much fear. But also not. Also, I mean, I think that, yes, it was scary, but it also felt like, I don't know, for myself it felt necessary. I feel like I feel like I've kind of said in the past that like I can't sit down to write something unless I feel fundamentally like angry about something. And I don't think that's thinking about it recently. I don't think that's the case. I think the real word is unless it doesn't come from an anger, it comes from a hunger. And for me, both because of an element of anger at feeling kind of the misappropriation of Christianity and kind of the Wicks, us against them, you know.
Very punitive version.
Well, yeah, in the language of warfare, which is a real part of my experience. I remember when I was a Christian, I went to many Christian camps, and I remember one of them I went to, kind of the culminating. I think I told you this. The culminating event of the week was something called night flight or something like that. And basically, it was this thing where the setup was the counselors said to all the campers, the thing that we've all known is coming has happened, and Christians are being hunted down by the government. And so the whole game was the campers started at one end of the camp and they turned off all the lights, and all the counselors were like the government officials with their flashlights, and you had to get from one end of camp to the other without getting caught. We fucking loved it. It was so much fun. It was a blast.
Right.
But
some of the metaphors are lost on you.
Oh my God. And thinking now, I mean, just the state of mind that puts you in as a Christian in regards to the outside world and the us against them and the notion of being persecuted and the notion of we have to protect ourselves all. The war language that encapsulated, and I wasn't aware of at the time, but it was a big part of my evangelical upbringing. So both addressing that in terms of the side of Wicks, but also, I don't know, also with Father Judd though, and this was also a very real part of being a Christian when I was younger, is the selfless, Christ-like love that is at the heart of the red ink parts of the New Testament, which is love your enemy. I mean, that's the hardest thing in the world, and I can speak, I'll aim it back at myself. Like right now, I'm not a Christian, I'm not right-wing, I'm the exact opposite on all those ends, and I'll sit there scrolling through social media, just getting angrier and angrier. The notion of loving my enemy in this moment, the notion of having that selfless empathy for a human being, even if I don't feel like they have earned or deserve it, that's radical right now. And that's also, I feel like, what I know I need more of, and I think the world generally needs more of right now. So it was genuinely feeling those two poles inside me in terms of my experience of faith growing up, and a hunger of wanting to have a forum in the script where I could just let them argue and talk, I guess, yeah.
Well, and then there's yet a third antagonist in a way, because Blanc is a skeptic and a true believer in a sense, the science of and the reason of human behavior and of even these things we call mysteries. And so I'm curious, as you were developing that character, like, had you always seen him in that way, or as you got to know him better, you were like, he is the perfect vessel to be essentially the secular spokesperson who believes in reason and science?
Well, he kind of took this on in order to fulfill this role in this story, and that for me is kind of, because I don't have some bigger like backstory written for Blanc or some notion of what he is. To me, he needs to stay consistent, but he develops in each story according to what he needs to be. But it made sense in this one for him to, and also like the first scene in this where he has a conversation with Father Judd in the church. That's actually a good example. When I wrote the script, that scene was a much softer scene, especially in terms of how Blanc came out of religion. And it was Daniel, and this is an example of, as a writer-director, listening to your actors. Daniel read it, and he had an instinct of, I think Blanc should come much harder at this. And I don't think I'm talking out of school. Daniel is much more on the side of Blanc just personally in his life. So at first I was like,
created more polarity because he.
Yeah, and at first I was like, well, you just want to get your anti-religion stuff in. But then I thought about it, and I kept listening to him, and I thought he's absolutely right, because the harder they're at odds at the beginning, the more satisfying their journey is going to be towards learning something from each other. And also at the end of it, which was very important at the end to me, by the way, that it's not like Blanc has a conversion. It's very important these two are still on opposite sides of the fence, and yet have found ways to learn from each other and connect to each other and form this bond and love between each other. That was something that was incredibly important to me at the end of the movie. And the harder they come to each other in that first scene, he was absolutely right. That just makes the journey more worth it, I guess.
And you can still feel the sublime mystery of the sun on his face. And it's beautiful. I am getting the time's up sign.
Ooh.
And so I just say thank you so much for giving us.
Karyn Kusama, thank you guys for coming. Guys, also, I don't know how many of you are sticking around. It is raining outside, so you don't want to go out there. Stick around and enjoy Brick. And I'm so happy